Welcome to Ministry Shift. We think it's episode 6. We've been debating that before we came online, but it's great to see you. And we're going to tackle a subject we looked at 2 weeks ago. We're going to look at funerals again. So this is imaginatively titled Funerals Part 2. But we have some very imaginative guests with us. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves very briefly so we know who you are. Let's start with Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Swift, and I'm the team rector of the North Potteries team ministry in Stoke-on-Trent.
The newly crowned.
The newly crowned, yeah.
As of the end of April. Margaret.
Yeah, Margaret Sherwin from the UTOX team, rector of 11 churches.
And Debbie.
Debbie Lochran, vicar for the East Telford benefice of 3 churches.
And last but by no means least, Jim.
Jim Trude, rector of St Matthew's Church in Walsall Civic Centre.
Welcome to you and to all those who are watching us live and all those who are going to be watching us as this goes out as a recorded episode. We're going to look at funerals. Last time we looked, I think, at some of the practical and pastoral issues around funerals at the current time and some of the particular challenges that poses for us. We wanted to take a slightly more theological shift in our thinking today, because one of the things I've discovered about this whole time is it does have a clarifying effect on helps us think a little bit not just about what we do but why we're doing it. And I guess when you're in a situation where you've got to take a funeral and you're only allowed a very small number of people and time may be limited, you are focusing quite carefully on what it is you think is really important to do and to get across when you conduct that funeral. So my first question is actually one that was raised by people who were putting comments on the Facebook page, and that is to say, who do we think the funeral is for, especially when there are so few people present, sometimes perhaps not even any of the family are able to be present. So what's the funeral for when we do it? I wonder, Andrew, if I could start with you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I've always felt that first and foremost, in many ways, the funeral is for the person who has died. And to that extent, to me, it doesn't necessarily matter whether there's 500 people there or 3. I'm doing something for the repose of the soul of the person who has died, commending them to God. And then on top of that, we're embroidering onto it the support for the family, the friends, and everything else. So, it's a bit of both and. But, for me personally, the comforting aspect of funerals for me at the moment is that I'm not doing anything different because it's always been focused on the person that's died.
Debbie, would that be your perspective on things?
I think it's a both and for me. I think that it's really important for the family because they feel that it's the last thing that they can do for that person is to give them a good send-off, to sort of celebrate their life and to hand them over to God and trust him with their safekeeping until they can meet again. But I think it's also very much for the person who's died. There is that sense of handing that person to God and for praying for the soul of that person. So I think it is both and for me, but perhaps more of a focus on the pastoral to the family side.
Jim, are you praying for the soul of the departed?
I think it's a bit of both, really. I think the prayer of commendation is really helpful in this when it talks about let us commend our brother or sister to God. And, there is a commendation aspect of it where we are commending a person to God. But the idea of us, I don't think it is just limited necessarily to those people who are in the crematorium or at the graveside. And that's where I think perhaps there's something about the communion of saints around this as well, and also perhaps the way that the Church of England has used the online facilities to actually encourage people to say a prayer at the time of the funeral. And I think there is something about joining together with others spiritually at this time.
Thank you, Margaret. When you take a funeral and there are very few people at the graveside or at the crematorium, sometimes you may have taken funerals recently when there's hardly anyone there at all. Where do you feel the focus lies?
It very much is about committing the person publicly to God. I mean, for me, when a person dies, they're not here anyway. They've gone. So sometimes I find it a bit strange that suddenly it's almost like the person is alive till we put them in, buried them or put them ready for cremation, but they've been dead some weeks. And so there's something about just acknowledging it publicly that a person has died. And so for me, it's disposing of the remains. In my experience of over 20 years of doing funerals, this is not the first time I've done funerals with hardly anybody there. And it doesn't matter whether there's just me with the person that's being commended to God and committed for burial or cremation, or whether there's 400 there. It's about that person and doing that sort of committing the remains and acknowledging this person lived and breathed and was among us. And now they're in that place where God is prepared, is prepared for them. So there's a little bit of what Andrew said in that, and then other things that Debbie and Jim have said. My theology is that actually a funeral is about getting rid of the body in the positive, nicest sense of the word, but also acknowledging the person has been a person.
So we're getting a good Anglican consensus, I think, around this. It's both, and that's excellent. But yeah, there is something quite important about whatever our theology of this, the kind of valuing of every human person, and marking that. And I wonder for the family where the focus lies, and which kind of leads me on to my second kind of question for this afternoon, which is about preaching at funerals in general, but also perhaps preaching again at a time of crisis, of great tragedy, where people will be asking questions about what on earth is God up to at the moment, afflicting us with this, and how do you preach resurrection on those sort of occasions? Debbie, how do you go about it?
I don't think that my focus has changed, to be honest with you. I always preach the resurrection. I always want to give people that hope and to speak to them about the love that God has for them and the promises that Christ made. And so I don't think that my approach has changed. I think what has changed that I've seen is with fewer people there, they seem to be listening more intently. And they seem to be taking more from it. I've had more phone calls after my funerals recently saying, well, I didn't really believe in God, but actually what you said has led me to phone you and can we have a conversation? So I'm finding that people are more receptive to that message of resurrection and to that message of hope at the moment than perhaps they have been before.
That other people's experience?
Well, I've gone back to bit before the resurrection. I talk now as much about the events of Good Friday, partly because it's Eastertide, but reflecting on the fact that actually after Jesus' death, his burial was hasty, without the usual ceremonies, without lots of people, without friends and family, and that it was sometime later when the women came to do something for him and then discovered the resurrection. So that leads into conversations about there are still things that we can do for your loved one later down the line, but also we can talk about resurrection in a new light as well, rather than simply going straight in with a resurrection message, which is perhaps what I did before.
Margaret, do you find your preaching has changed or is different as a consequence of the current crisis?
Yes, because of the way that I would do the eulogy with the reflection from the Bible reading. But I found something really helpful this past week when I've been doing some of the theological thinking around funerals and things, and being reminded that in the Beatitudes, it's there for us to read that blessed are those who mourn. So part of my sort of preaching at the sermon, at the funeral, the preaching part is reminding that those who mourn that they are blessed, and that leads me into the resurrection sort of story, and that we are in the Easter season of being blessed, even in the midst of all that we're going through. There is a hope, and that's because of the resurrection story. So it has changed, because I'm not doing eulogies. They all know who it is that they're there. for the funeral for. They all know that, but we do share memories. So I do ask them for memories, from the youngest to the eldest in the family, to send me some memories that can be shared. And I do that and usually link that in with the resurrection story.
Do you think your taking of funerals might be different after we're through all this?
I think it's certainly a little bit shorter than they were, in that sense. Broadly speaking, though, I think the message is still the same. The message of hope. Death is not the end. And yes, there is a time of mourning. I'm very interested in what Andrew said. I think that was excellent and very helpful. But funerals naturally, I think, open up questions in people's minds, no matter whether somebody's died suddenly or it's expected. It still opens up questions, and that, I think, is part of our job, is to point to perhaps where they might find answers.
Yeah, and Andrew, your use of the scriptures there, I mean, have people found particular Bible passages are speaking to you more, or you're using more at funerals at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to use in Eastertide one of the resurrection gospels, but I have now tacked on the Good Friday aspect of it as well. One of the other passages that actually somebody requested quite out of the blue was a passage from Isaiah 55, and it worked splendidly. That's Isaiah 55, 6 to 13, and it's the one that ends with you'll go out with joy and trees of the fields will clap their hands. And it worked really well as a message from the person who had died to those who are left. And I think the use of scripture is a bit more imaginative than perhaps it has been before. And I think the lens that we're looking through now is proving very helpful at slightly unusual or different passages of scripture that people liked for other reasons, and they're coming into their own now.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your contribution in Funerals Part 2. I don't know whether we'll get to Part 3 or not, but either way, please do tune in on Thursday at 4:30, when I haven't checked this, but I hope there is another ministry shift, and certainly we'll be back again at 4:30 next Monday. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to you for watching.